Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the course Global Communication. I'm going to discuss with you today UNESCO and the New World Information and Communication Order. First, I'm going to talk about UNESCO, then later I will discuss the New World Information and Communication Order. So, UNESCO and its mandate for international cooperation can be traced back to a League of Nations resolution on 21st September 1921 to elect a commission to study feasibility. So, what does it mean by UNESCO, or the abbreviation of UNESCO? UNESCO means that United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. This new body, the International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation, was created in 1922 and counted such figures as Henry Bergson, Albert Einstein, and Marie Curie and Robert Millikan. These were the people among its members, being thus a small commission of the League of Nations essentially centered on Western Europe. The International Institute for Intellectual Cooperation was then created in Paris on 9 August 1925 to act as the executing agency for the ICIC. However, the onset of World War II largely interrupted the work of these, which is called predecessors organizations. As for private initiatives, the International Bureau of Education began to work as a non-governmental organization in the service of international education or educational development since 1925 and joined UNESCO in 1969 after having established a joint commission in 1952. So what was the need of UNESCO creation? After the signing of the Atlantic Charter and the Declaration of the United Nations, the Conference of Allied Ministers of Education began meetings in London, which continued from November 1942 to December 1945, which means for 3 years. And then in 1943, the necessity for an international organization was expressed in the Moscow Declaration, agreed upon by China, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the USSR, which is Russia. This was followed by the Dumbarton Oaks Conference proposal of 1942. Upon the proposal of CAM, and in accordance with the recommendations of the United Nations Conference on an International Organization held in San Francisco in 1945, a United Nations Conference for the establishment of an educational and cultural organization was convened in London. The idea of UNESCO was largely developed by Rob Butler, the Minister of Education for the United Kingdom, who had a great deal of influence in its development. The Constitution of UNESCO was introduced and signed by about 37 countries, and Preparatory Commissions was established. The Preparatory Commissions operated between November 1945 to November 1946, which is almost 1 year, the date when UNESCO's constitutions came into force with the deposit of the 20th ratification by a member state. The first General Conference took place from November to December 1946, and they elected the Dr. Julian to Director General. The Constitution was amended in November 1954, when the General Conference resolved that members of the Executive Board would be representatives of the governments of the states, of which they are nationals, and wouldn't, as before, act in their personal capacity. This change in governance distinguished UNESCO from its predecessors. The ICIC, in how members states would work together in the organization's field of competence. As members states work together over time to utilize UNESCO's mandate, political and historical factors shaped the organization's operations, in particularly during the Cold War and the decolonization process and the dissolution of the USSR, which is Russia. Next, I'm going to discuss with you the New World Information and Communication Order. The New World Information and Communication Order is a term coined in a debate over media representations of the developing world. In UNESCO in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The New World Information and Communication Order, the movement was part of a broadened effort to formally tackle global economic inequality that was viewed as a legacy of imperialism upon the global South. The term was widely used by the MacBride Commission, a UNESCO panel chaired by Nobel Peace Prize winner Sean MacBride, which was charged with creation of a set of recommendations to make global media representations more equitable. The MacBride Commission produced a report which is called Many Voices, One Word. It was a title which outlined the main philosophical points of the New World Information and Communication Orders. The fundamental issues of imbalances in global communication had been discussed for some time. The American media scholar Wilbur Scram, he noted in 1964 that the flow of news among nations is thin, that much attention is given to developed countries and little to less developing ones, that important events are ignored and reality is distorted. From a more radical perspective, the Herbert Scheller, he observed in 1969 that developing countries had little meaningful input into decisions about radio frequency allocations for a satellite as a key meeting in Geneva in 1962. The Scheller, he pointed out that many satellites had military applications like Intelsat, which was set up for international cooperation in satellite communication, was also dominated by the United States. In the 1970s, these and other issues were taken up by the non-aligned movements and debated within the United States and UNESCO. Next, I'm going to discuss with you that the mass media concerns began with the meeting of non-aligned nations in Algiers in 1973, again in Tunis 1976. Later in 1976, at the New Delhi, the Ministerial Conference of Non-Aligned Nations, the New Order Plan was textually formulated by the Tunisian Information Minister Mustafa Masmoudi. The Mustafa submitted working paper of number 1331 to the MacBride Commission. These proposals of 1978 were titled the Mass Media Declaration. The MacBride Commission at the time was a 16-member body created by the UNESCO to study communication issues. The UNESCO work on the New World Information and Communication Order was immediately met with criticism for many areas. An interim report released in 1979 by UNESCO was targeted by the American Newspaper Publishers Association and the American Society of Newspapers Editors. While these organizations took issues with some of the early proposals, including right of reply and press councils, they also were troubled by the phrase New World Information and Communication Order, seeing it as a dog whistle for the use of government propaganda and the guise of information flow balance. Next, let me discuss with you about the developments of the NWICO. The debate on the New World Information and Communication Order that started in the 1970s reflected criticism about non-equitable access to information and media imperialism. The NWICO saw the United Kingdom and the United States back out of UNESCO until 1997, for the UK and 2003 for the United States. In between 1990 to 2000, a switch occurred globally, carried by the Internet, that contributed to bring more equity to the available content. This was supported by the extension of the media powers to developing countries such as Mexico, Korea, Kenya, and Nigeria, by the adoptions of protectionist measures in regards to the free market by Western countries like Canada and France, and with the rise of satellite broadcasting as a transnational means for non-Western countries. Still, evidence suggests global media has a strong bias towards the global north. Studies estimate around 80% of international news travels through Reuters, the Agence France Presse, United Press International, and the Associated Press. Only around 20% of this news focuses on developing countries. In the decades following the NWICO debates, little changed in this regard as a study on stories relating to Africa in the New York Times and the Washington Post showed in 2000. In this study of 89 articles are lacked sufficient contexts linking the West to Africa, and 25 of them were negative in content. Given such a heritage, it can be argued that little in NWICO was in fact new. Its essence was made up of old ideas and established principles which were just brought together under a new umbrella. For example, the problem of global imbalance of information structures was recognized by the United Nations long before any great debate on NWICO. The UN's Economic and Social Council, they addressed the problem as early as in around about 1961. 1 year later, the UN General Assembly expressed its concerns over the fact that 70% of the population of the world lack adequate information facilities and are thus denied effective enjoyment of the right to information, and invited the governments of developed countries to cooperate with less developed countries in connections with this program for the development of independent national information media with due regard for the culture of each country. Moreover, as early as in 1952, a UN General Assembly resolution considered that it is essential for a proper development of public opinion in underdeveloped countries that independent domestic information enterprises should be given facilities and essences in order that they may be enabled to contribute to the spread of information, to the development of national culture, and to the international understanding, and continued that the time has arrived for the elaboration of a concrete program and plan of action in this respect. Different issues were suggested to talk about. Issues of space communication were not only the only challenges to the old information order. The decolonizations became recognized in the 1960s not only as an independence movement in the Third World, but also as a set of principles in international relations, ultimately leading to the declaration on the new international economic order by the UN General Assembly in 1974, followed by the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States by the same supreme body of the international community in 1974. Parallel to this development, the concept of human rights was evolving from the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights to a more definite set of principles codified as a part and parcel of international law in the International Covenant on Civil and Political and Political Rights, in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. These covenants, adopted in 1966, had a direct bearing upon information and communication in a manner quite far from the simple free flow doctrine. The same applies to regional conventions on human rights adopted in Western Europe as early as in 1950, in the Americans in 1969, and in Africa in 1981. Apart from a progressive codification of human rights at large, the particular aspects of realism and apartheid got their specific international conventions, which contain articles with specific references to mass communication. Other instruments again introduced a link between peace and international understanding on the one hand, and on the content of education, culture, and communication on the other hand. The journalist operates in the contemporary world within the framework of a movement towards new international relations in general and a new information order in particular. This new order understood as an integral part of the new international economic order, which is aimed at the decolonizations and democratization of the field of information and communication, both nationally and internationally, on the basis of peaceful coexistence among peoples and with full respect for their cultural identity. The journalist has a special obligation to promote the process of democratization of international relations and the field of information, in particular by safeguarding and fostering peaceful and friendly relations among states and peoples. The concept of NWICO was compressed here by 3 sentences only, but they pretty well cover its essence, and it is worth nothing that the speaker here are the non-governmental professionals through their representative organization, who in many respects were more outspoken and uncompromising than respective governmental bodies, such as UNESCO had been. In fact, the NWICO concept articulated in these professional principles was practically identical with the norm version of the concept, although most of the consultative club members came from outside the norm circle. This shows how pervasive and timely the concept was, at least until the 1980s. I think this is enough for today. Thank you so much for watching my lecture. Kindly subscribe my channel so that whenever I upload a next video lecture, you will get it easily. Thank you once again and best of luck.